I never imagined I'd turn into the kind of person who keeps a meticulous file of every single HOA violation. But that's exactly what happened. My name is David Winters, and I live on the only piece of property in Maplewood Heights that existed long before the neighborhood did. My grandfather built our family's cabin on the edge of Crystal Lake in 1942. When developers came around in the 1990s, my family sold off the surrounding land but held on to our original 2,000 acres, lake and all. The neighborhood ended up being built around us, forming a neat little half-circle of nearly identical houses, all facing my land like it was some kind of stage. The HOA tried to rope us into their jurisdiction early on, but our deed predated their very existence by decades. We were excluded both legally and literally. The woods, the lake, the mineral rights, and most importantly, the utility easements all remain under my family's control. For 2 decades, things ran smoothly. The earlier HOA boards understood the arrangement. They got to promote lake views and access to trails in their brochures, while we allowed them to run a few utility lines across our land to service the far side of the subdivision. It was simple, clear, and completely documented. That piece ended 6 months ago when a woman named Brenda Hawthorne was elected HOA president. Brenda was the kind of person who peaked in high school and spent the next 30 years trying to live in that spotlight again. She wore her hair the same way as in her senior photo, drove a white Range Rover with HOA Prez on the plate, and approached every interaction like she was sealing a corporate merger. Within weeks, she tripled the fines, added a mountain of new rules about things like mailbox height, and began writing up residents for grass that was barely taller than regulation. I didn't get on her radar until she spotted me checking my mail one afternoon. She pulled up, rolled down her window with a smile that looked glued on, and told me my truck was parked incorrectly. I politely reminded her that my property wasn't part of the HOA. She gave a condescending laugh and said, "Everyone here follows the rules." From that point, the violation letters started pouring in. Noise complaints when I took my boat out. Citations claiming my dock was the wrong color, even though it had been that way for decades. Notices accusing my property of lowering home values, despite the fact that it was worth more than the entire subdivision combined. I ignored them all and filed them in what I started calling my evidence folder. The real storm hit when Brenda decided to reinterpret the utility easement one Tuesday morning. She showed up at my door in a blazer, despite it being 90 degrees outside, carrying a manila folder like it contained top-secret files. She triumphantly announced that she'd found a loophole giving the HOA rights to develop the lakefront. I laughed out loud, which clearly wasn't the reaction she wanted. She flushed red and told me she had already spoken to a realtor about the untapped potential of our land. According to her, the HOA could rake in millions by selling lake access. When I told her that was impossible since the property belonged to me, she smirked and said, "We'll see." 2 days later, my neighbor Jim, who sat on the HOA board, called to warn me. Brenda had held an emergency meeting and convinced the board that the easement allowed development. She even hired her cousin, a realtor named Todd, to begin showing my property to potential investors. Jim voted against it, but he was outnumbered 5-1. That weekend, I saw Todd leading a group of developers down to my dock, pointing out future marina sites and waving his arms at my tree line like he owned the place. I calmly informed them they were trespassing. Todd actually tried to hand me a business card for the upcoming project. That was the last straw. I called my lawyer, Robert Chun. Robert reviewed the documents and confirmed exactly what I knew. The easement was for utilities only, no development rights. But he pointed out something useful. Because those lines ran to my land, I had the legal right to control access for safety and maintenance. Meanwhile, I dug deeper and found that Brenda and Todd had already accepted deposits from 3 developers. They'd even presented plans to the county for a massive 2,000-acre project, complete with 300 houses and a shopping center. They had pre-sold 20 lots at $500,000 each. At the next HOA meeting, the place was packed. Brenda stood at the podium, speaking like she was delivering a victory speech, promising property values would rise 30% thanks to the new lakefront community. She even handed out glossy brochures with artist renderings. They had renamed my land, Hawthorne Shores. When I stood up during public comment, she tried to silence me, saying non-members weren't allowed to speak. I calmly explained to the room that I owned the lake and the land being sold. The room went dead quiet. Brenda tried to brush it off, claiming their lawyers had already confirmed the HOA's rights. That's when I revealed the detail about the utility easement access and my plan to shut it down for full safety inspections. She waved it off as an empty threat, but I clarified it wasn't a threat at all. It was a legal necessity, thanks to the unapproved traffic she had brought onto my property. Every single easement would need to be reviewed, which could take weeks or even months. The room exploded in shouting. Jim turned to Brenda and demanded to know if she had really been showing off land that didn't belong to the HOA. Another board member, Susan, stood up and demanded to know what happened to the deposits Todd had been collecting. Brenda kept insisting it was all legitimate, but her denials came out shrill and shaky, her confidence unraveling in front of everyone. I told them plainly they had 48 hours to stop all activity on my land and refund every cent they'd taken. If they didn't, I would shut down the easements for safety inspections. Brenda's face twisted with fury as she promised their lawyers would be in touch. I smiled and told her I looked forward to it before walking out. The very next morning, Todd showed up again with another group of investors, this time measuring my tree line as if they were already breaking ground. I arrived with Robert, my attorney, and 2 sheriff's deputies. The deputies handed out trespass notices and escorted the whole group off my property. Todd tried to argue the HOA had authorized him, but the deputies weren't buying it. That afternoon, Brenda marched to my door flanked by 3 men in suits she introduced as the HOA's legal team. Their lead attorney confidently declared they would sue me if I blocked access to the utilities. Robert, who had been waiting inside, stepped forward and handed them a thick stack of papers. He explained that we were filing suit against them for fraud, trespassing, and attempted theft of private property, and reminded them that selling land you don't own is a federal crime. The lawyers' faces drained of color. One leaned toward Brenda and whispered urgently. Brenda forced a smile and claimed this was all just a misunderstanding, that perhaps we could negotiate. I told her she still had less than 24 hours to return every deposit, or I would enforce the shutdown. The deadline passed without any action. So at 9 sharp Thursday morning, I posted legal notices at every utility access point on my property. Entry was prohibited without written notice and my supervision. The water, power, cable, all of it depended on those easements. Within 3 hours, some houses had already lost water pressure. By noon, electricity was flickering across the neighborhood. By evening, cable and internet were completely out. My phone rang constantly, but I only took calls from Robert. He told me Brenda had tried for an emergency injunction, but the judge sided with us. We had full authority to secure our land, especially after repeated trespassing. The following morning, the neighborhood turned against Brenda. Dozens of furious residents gathered outside her house, demanding answers about their lost utilities, the money, and the supposed development. Jim, the board member who'd always supported me, called laughing under his breath to tell me the HOA had scheduled an emergency meeting that night. The community center was packed wall to wall. Brenda tried to maintain her composure at the podium, but the residents shouted her down. Finally, Roger, one of the original board members, took the microphone. He made a motion to remove Brenda as president on the spot. The vote passed unanimously, except Brenda's, which didn't count. Jim was named interim president, and his first order of business was to apologize to me and request I restore the utilities. I agreed, but only under strict conditions. The HOA had to sign a new agreement acknowledging my absolute ownership of the land, promising never to challenge it again. On top of that, I demanded written apologies from Brenda and Todd, along with proof that every deposit had been refunded. That's when Susan, the treasurer, dropped the bombshell. $10 million was missing from the HOA's accounts. Brenda had funneled it into Todd's company under guise of development expenses for land they never owned. The room went completely silent before erupting in outrage. Someone called the police, and within an hour, both Brenda and Todd were in custody. Because investors in other states had been involved, the FBI soon took over. Investigators uncovered a tangled web of fraud. Not only had they stolen HOA funds, but they had forged surveys, drafted fake deeds, and even attempted to bribe a county clerk into altering property records. They had also used mail and interstate communications to solicit money, which turned the case federal. Prosecutors charged them with mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy, each carrying decades-long sentences. 6 months later, the trial revealed the full scope of the scheme. Todd eventually broke down on the stand and confessed, admitting Brenda promised him 30% of profits if the development went through. He revealed that Brenda had pursued the HOA presidency specifically to get access to legal funds and community resources to fuel her plan. Brenda tried to argue she believed the HOA genuinely had rights to my land, but her own emails sealed her fate. Messages were shown to the jury where she mocked me as a stupid landowner and boasted that she'd be rich once she forced me out. The jury didn't take long, less than 2 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Todd received 8 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay back $5 million. When it was Brenda's turn, the judge looked her straight in the eye and said she had betrayed her community and abused her position to commit massive fraud. He sentenced her to 12 years in federal prison, plus $10 million in restitution. As the sentence was read, Brenda's composure finally shattered. Her knees buckled, and she had to be helped back to her seat, her face pale with shock. The same woman who once strutted around in a Range Rover, handing out fines from Mailbox Heights, was now staring at over a decade behind bars, all because she thought she could steal what never belonged to her.